everyone, and welcome to Unit 9, Module 51. We're talking about the adolescent stage of development, physical and cognitive. Here are your learning objectives, and here are your vocab. So adolescence is defined as like a transition period between childhood and adulthood. It begins around puberty and ends in adulthood. And so adulthood would be considered when you are completely independent. So in some cultures where teens are self-supporting already, that this age that we're talking about, these life experiences, they don't exactly apply as we've defined them, as that in-between period where you're not completely independent, but you're also not a child. Stanley Hall has a famous quote regarding adolescence, which is that it is a time period of storm and stress. And so why is that? Well, there's a lot going on physically. So puberty is when humans mature sexually. So there's a surge of hormones kind of ruling the body in some ways, and that's triggering physical changes to the body. And just like we talked about earlier with childhood, the timing isn't necessarily the same for everyone. It's not the same for everyone, but the sequence of physical changes are predictable, like the order of them. There is the menarche, which is the first menstrual period, and boys who are on the earlier end of maturing physically, so they're the younger, but they're still stronger, more athletic, etc. They are actually more at risk for alcohol use, for delinquency, for premature sexual activity, etc. And I know I've said this several times in class, but adolescence, your brain is still developing. Your brain is still developing until you're around age 25. Some say a little bit later even. And specifically the frontal lobes are lagging behind everything else. So you have hormones and your limbic system really developing and in control of things. Remember, that's your reward system, your emotions, all that. And the frontal lobes are kind of behind that. So it leads adolescents to be more impulsive, engage in more risky behaviors because they're not really like focused on the long term, and kind of more emotional storms, as the book calls it, which really just means like more extreme. So there's also something that goes on in the brain during this time period, and that is pruning. And that means at birth, you're born with like neurons and certain neural connections, and at the 6-year-old point, if you look at this picture, look at all those neurons and neural networks, right? There's so many. 6-year-olds learn way more than we do every single day, like every hour. They're learning way more than us. And so by 14 years old, that pruning process has begun, that use it or lose it process. So, and you can see that with the less dense neural networks there. And in 2004, because of all these factors, specifically the frontal lobe factor, the APA and along with 700 medical associations argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that the death penalty should not be used on 16 and 17. Piaget, remember, he came up with the cognitive stages of development. So Lawrence Kohlberg took those ideas of how we think and how that develops, and he tried to take those and apply them to how we develop our moral compass. And this is his theory of morality. He came up with 3 basic levels. There are actually levels inside of each level, but you really just need to focus on the 3 basic levels. I think it can help to know the levels inside the levels to understand each level easier, but the 3 basic levels is what you need to know. He would ask the boys that he studied, he would ask them a question, a moral dilemma. It's actually the one we're going to talk about is the Heinz dilemma. And he would say, was this decision that this person made right or wrong? And they would answer. And then he would focus on, okay, why? And so their rationale, their judgment of why it was right or wrong is what he uses to classify their moral level of thinking. So there's pre-conventional, and this would be children mostly. Conventional, which would be earlier adolescence, and then post-conventional, which is older adolescence to adulthood. Now, obviously, someone can be an adult and be in conventional, and a lot of people actually are. So it has ages on there, but really they're much more broad than that. So limitations on Kohlberg. So first, I kind of mentioned this. He only studied males, and Carol Gilligan, pictured here, she criticized him for this, rightly so, because she felt like these stages that he came up with, based on the responses that he got, were really dismissive of why a female might have a different perspective on this. And so women would actually score a little bit lower than men. And so she created her own female stages of moral development. His work was also criticized because it was really culturally limited, really focusing on Western culture that emphasizes individualism, and that really post-conventional thinking really only works as the highest level of moral thinking in an individualist society. So, moral intuition. So on this topic of moral thinking, because Kohlberg's all about what's your rationale? Why did you come to that decision? But a lot of our day-to-day moral decision making is automatic. Like, we're disgusted by something someone did, we're feeling like excited or energized or happy about watching some moral courageous act that someone did for someone else. So these are very intuitive. So Jonathan Haidt, he thinks a lot of this is moral intuition. It's a quick gut, automatic response that is emotion driven. And he even realized that if we have, and we've talked about this kind of before, we have a connection between what we're physically feeling and what we're experiencing. So if we have a disgusting taste in our mouth, we're actually more our disgust over people being morally corrupt is actually even higher. We're more disgusted by them if we have a disgusting taste in our mouth. When we see someone be generous, like I said, we feel tingly and warm in our chest about what they're doing. There's a whole example that he gives about a runaway trolley. It's headed for 5 people. You can push the switch or pull the switch to divert it, and 1 person will get killed, but you'll save 5. So most people respond and say, sure, of course, kill 1 to save 5, that makes sense. But when he does the same scenario, and now you have to push someone onto the tracks that will stop the train, and it will still save 5 people, more people then say, no, I wouldn't do that. So he's saying that difference it's the same rationale. You would still kill 1 to save 5, but when people have to get emotionally involved, then they wouldn't do it. So he's saying there's something more that people are using than just reason, because kill 1 to save 5 is still the same in both situations. So others say we do rely on this moral emotion, but we can override this automatic thought by slowing it down and using reason. And plenty of groups do try to do this, self or monitor each other to do this. So moral action also influences our attitudes. We we act morally based on how society kind of tells us what we should do or we feel expected to do. The book points out about how many Nazi concentration camps were, the guards were ordinary, everyday people that their neighbor next door would say, that was a good person, and here they are in this situation that has influenced them. So sometimes people who are otherwise good people can actually do morally horrible things because of the social situation that they're in. So as children develop, they become more caring of others, empathetic. They're able to do that more, so they're becoming less selfish. And a lot of education programs actually kind of work to encourage taking action to serve others. And research shows that this moral action feeds the attitude of morality. So they're more likely to do well in many ways if they are in these programs. So takeaways. Remember Kohlberg's 3 moral stages: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Know that Carol Gilligan criticized him for his male-centric theory, came up with her own. Jonathan Haidt says that moral intuition guides us, but it can be overridden by that moral reasoning. And moral action feeds moral attitude. All right, so that sums up Module 51, and I will see you in class.